Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, for coming today, and thank you for bringing me to Victoria. I have met so many wonderful people here, and we've been having excellent conversations on every subject related to philosophy and literature and life. I'll tell you just up front, I don't like to monologue. I don't like to have a one-way conversation where I'm just doing the talking. I like dialogue. I like talking to people. I like to hear what you have to say. And actually, we can get a whole lot more done in terms of getting to know each other, getting important questions on the table, if we talk to each other, and I find out what it is you're interested in, and I can respond. But first, we need to prime the pump, maybe a little bit, to get started. And so I will monologue. I'm going to have to apologize for a one-way conversation, but I'd like to read a little bit of the book that they have out front, which amazes me, is now 20 years old. And that 1990, right? And I started writing it in 1983, so that tells you how long this material goes back and how long I've been reading it. But I do enjoy reading it, so I hope you will enjoy just a section that I'm going to read for you right now. I'm going to start with chapter 1, and it's called Entry the First. Can you all hear me without any problem? Is this guy's working? Okay. Entry the First, June 14, 1830. Of all the things that drive men to sea, the most common disaster I've come to learn is women. I always get in trouble with that line. It's the first line, I'm sorry. But this guy really loves women, all right? In my case, it was a spirited Boston schoolteacher named Isadora Bailey who led me to become a cook aboard the Republic. Both Isadora and my creditors, I should add, who entered into a conspiracy, a trap, a scheme so cunning that my only choices were prison, a brief stay in the stony oubliette of the Spanish calabozo, or a long one at the bottom of the Mississippi, or marriage, which was, for a man of my temperament, worse than imprisonment, especially if you knew Isadora. So, I went to sea, sailing from Louisiana on April 14, 1830, hoping a quarter year aboard a slave clipper would give this relentless woman time to reconsider and my bill collectors time to forget they'd ever heard the name Rutherford Calhoun. But what lay ahead in Africa, then later on the open, endless sea, was, as I shall tell you, far worse than the fortune I'd fled in New Orleans. New Orleans, you should know, was a city tailored to my taste for the excessive exotic fringes of life, a world port of such extravagance in 1829 when I arrived from southern Illinois, a newly freed bondsman, my papers in an old portmanteau, a gift from my master in Macondo, that I dropped my bags and a shock of recognition shot up my spine to my throat, rolling off my tongue, and I whispered, "Here, Rutherford, is home." So it seems, those first few months to the country boy with cotton in his hair, a great whore of a city in her glory, a kind of glandular golden age. She was, if not a town devoted to an almost religious pursuit of sin, then at least to a steamy sexuality. To the newcomer, she was an assault of smells, molasses commingled with mangoes in the sensually damp air, the stench of slop in a muddy street, and from the labyrinthal warehouses on the docks, the odor of Brazilian coffee and Mexican oils. And also this, the most exquisitely beautiful women in the world, thoroughbreds of pleasure, created 2 centuries before by the French for their enjoyment, mulattoes colored like magnolia petals, quadroons with breasts big as melons, women who smelled like roses all year round. Home? Brother, for a randy Illinois boy of 2 and 20 accustomed to cornfields, cow plops, and hand jobs in his master's hayloft, New Orleans wasn't home. It was heaven. But even paradise must have its backside too, and it is here, alas, that the newcomer comes to rest. Upstream there were waterfront saloons and dives, a black underworld of thieves, gamblers, and ne'er-do-wells who, unlike the Creoles downstream, they sniffed down their long continental noses at poor purebred Negroes like myself, didn't give a tinker's damn about my family tree, and welcomed me as the world downstream would not. In plain English, I was a petty thief. How I fell into this life of living off others, of being a social parasite, is a long, sordid story, best shortened for those who, like the Greeks, prefer to keep their violence off stage. Naturally, I looked for honest work, but arriving in the city, checking the saloons and Negro bars, I found nothing. So I stole. It came as second nature to me. My master, Reverend Peleg Chandler, had noticed the stickiness of my fingers when I was a child and a tendency I had to tell preposterous lies for the hell of it. He was convinced I was born to be hanged and did his damnedest to re-educate said fingers in finer pursuits, such as good penmanship and playing the grand piano in his parlor. A biblical scholar, he endlessly preached Old Testament virtues to me, and to this very day I remember his tedious disquisitions on Neoplatonism, the evils of nominalism, the genius of Aquinas, and the work of such seers as Meister Eckhart. He wanted me to become a Negro preacher, perhaps even a black saint like the South American priest Martin de Porres, or for that matter, my own brother Jackson. Yet for all that theological background, I have always been drawn by nature to extremes. Since the hour of my manumission, a day of such gloom and depression that I must put off its telling for a while, if you'll be patient with me, since that day, and where I can only call my older brother Jackson's spineless behavior in the face of freedom, I have never been able to do things halfway. And I hungered, literally hungered, for life in all of its shades and hues. I was hooked on sensation, you might say, a lecher for perception and the nerve-knocking thrill, like a shot of opium, of new experiences. And so, with the hateful, dull Illinois farm behind me, I drifted about New Orleans those first few weeks, pilfering food and picking money belts off tourists. But don't be too quick to pass judgment. I may be from Southern Illinois, but I'm not stupid. City folks live by cheating and crime. Everybody knew this. Everybody saw it. Everybody talked ethics piously, then took payoffs under the table, tampered with the till, or fattened his purse by duping the poor. Shameless, you say? Perhaps so. But had I not been a thief, I would not have met Isadora, and shortly thereafter found myself literally at sea. Sometimes, after working the hotels for visitors, or when I was drying out from whiskey or a piece of $2 tail, I would sneak off to the waterfront, and there, sitting on the rain-leached pier in heavy liquescent air, in shimmering light so soft and opalescent that sunlight could not fully pierce the fine erotic mist, limpid and luminous at dusk, I would stare out to sea, envying the sailors riding out on merchantmen on the gift of good weather, wondering if there was some far-flung port, a foreign country, or island far away at the earth's rim where a free man could escape the vanities city folk called self-interest, the mediocrity they called achievement, the blatant selfishness they called individual freedom, all the bilge that made each day landside a kind of living death. I don't know if you ever farmed in the Midwest, but if you have, you'll know that Southern Illinois has scale, fields like sea swell, soil so good that if you plant a stick, a year later, a carriage will spring up in its place. Forests and woods as wild as they were before people lost their pioneer spirit and a healthy sense of awe. Only here, on the waterfront, could I recapture that feeling. Wind off the water was like a fist of fresh air, a cleansing blow that made me feel momentarily clean. In the spill of yellow moonlight, I'd shuck off my boots and sink both feet into the water. But the pier was most beautiful, I think, in early morning, when sunlight struck the wood and made it steam as moisture and mist from the night before evaporated. Then, you could believe, like the ancient philosopher Thales, that the analog for life was water, the formless, omnifix sea. Businessmen with 100 duties barnacled to their lives came to stare longingly at boats trolling up to dock. Black men, free and slave, sat quietly on rocks coated with crustacea in the odors of oil and fish, studying an evening sky as blue as the skin of heathen Lord Krishna, or the aliens in Avatar. Just saw that. And Isadora Bailey came too, though for what reason I cannot say. Her expression on the pier was unreadable, since she was, as I soon learned, a woman grounded physically and metaphysically in the land. I tipped closer to her, eyeing the bead purse on her lap, and thought better of boosting it when I was ambushed by the innocence, the alarming trust in her eyes when she looked up at me. I wondered, and I wonder still, what's a nice girl like her doing in a city like this? She was, in fact, as out of place in New Orleans as St. Teresa would be at an orgy with de Sade. A frugal, quiet, devoutly Christian girl, I learned, the fourth daughter of a large Boston family free since the Revolutionary War, and she was positively ill with Eastern culture. An educated girl of 20, she thought it best to leave home to lighten her family's burden, but she found no prospects for a Negro teacher, and female at that, in the Northeast. She came south by coach, avoiding the newfangled trains after reading an expert say that traveling at over 20 miles an hour would suffocate all aboard when the speed sucked all the air from the cars. Once in New Orleans, she took a job as a nursery governess for the children of Madame Marie Toulouse, a Creole who had spent her young womanhood as the mistress of first a banker, then a famous actor, a minister, and finally a mortician. Why these four? As Madame Toulouse told Isadora, she'd use the principle of 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go. And they'd left her, and they'd left her generous endowments that she invested in a hotel at Royal and St. Peter's Street. But Isadora was not, I'm afraid, any happier living in a Creole household than I would have been. They were beautiful, and she was bookish. They were society here, and she was, as a northerner, the object of polite condescension. The Toulouses, in short, could afford the luxury of stupidity, the blind, cow-like, chin-lifted hauteur of beautiful people. And such luxury Isadora had never known. You had the feeling, once you knew her, that she gambled on knowledge as others gambled on power, believing, wrongly I think, that she had little else to offer. She let herself get fat, for example, to end the pressure women feel from being endlessly oogled and propositioned. Men hardly noticed her, pudgy as she was, and this suited Isadora just fine. She had a religious respect for work. She was a nervous eater, too, I guess, the sort of lonely, intelligent woman who found comfort in food or went to restaurants simply to be treated kindly by the waiters, to be fussed over and served, to be asked, "Is everything all right here?" Yet she was pretty in a prim, dry, flat-breasted way. Isadora never used makeup. At age 5, she had been sentenced to the straightening comb, and since then kept her hair pinned back so tightly each glossy strand stood out like wire, which also pulled back the skin at her temples, pushing forward a nose that looked startlingly like a doorknob, and enlarging 2 watery moon-like eyes that seemed ever on the verge of tears. No, she wasn't much to look at, nor was the hotel room where she lived, with 8 one-eyed cats, 2 three-legged dogs, and birds with broken wings. Most often her place had a sweet attic-like odor, but looked like a pet shop and sometimes smelled like a zoo. Isadora took in these handicapped strays, unable to see them left unattended, and each time I dropped by, she had something new. No, not a girl to tell your friends about, but one reassuring to be with, because she had an inner brilliance, an intelligence and clarity of spirit that overwhelmed me. Did I love Isadora? Really, I couldn't say. I'd always felt people fell in love as they might fall into a hole. It was something I thought a smart man avoided. But some days, after weeks of whoring and card games that lasted 3 days and nights, I found myself at her hotel room, drunk as Noah, broke and bottomed out, holding a bouquet of stolen flowers outside her door, eager to hear her voice, which was velvety and light, like water gently rushing nearby. We'd sit and talk. She abhorred nature walks, claiming that the only thing she knew about nature was that it itched. Her menagerie of crippled beasts crawling over her lap and mine. Those afternoons of genteel conversation, Isadora wouldn't let me do anything else. We talked of how we both were newcomers to New Orleans, or we took short walks together, or we dined at sidewalk cafes, where we watched the Creoles. My earliest impressions of the cabildo, the fancy dress quadroon balls and slave auctions arranged by the firm of Hewlett and Bright each Saturday at the New Exchanged Market, ghastly affairs I must add, which made poor Isadora ill, These were interwoven with her voice, her reassuring Protestant soap and water smell. She was good, and honest and forthright was Isadora. Nevertheless, at other times, she was intolerable. She was, after all, a teacher. And she couldn't... and she couldn't turn it off sometimes. That tendency to talk in propositions or declarative sentences, to correct my Southern Illinois accent with its squashed vowels and missing consonants, and challenge everything I said on, I thought, general principle. Really, Rutherford, she said one afternoon in her sitting room, her back to a deep-silled window where outside a pear tree was in full bloom, its fruit like 100 green bells draped upon the branches. You don't think you can keep this up forever, do you? The gambling and girl-chasing? She gave her gentle spinster's smile and, as always, looked at me with a steadier gaze than I could look at her. You have a mind, and if what you tell me is true, you've lacked for nothing in this life. Am I right in saying this, neither in childhood education nor the nourishment of a sound body and Christian character? I gave her a nod, for this was so. Though a slaveholder, Reverend Chandler hated slavery. He'd inherited my brother and me from his father, and out of Christian guilt taught us more than some white men in Macondo knew, then finally released us both one by one, except that Jackson stayed, more deeply bound to our master than any of us dreamed. But I am not ready just yet to talk of my brother, Jackson Calhoun. So, you were, Isadora asked, toying with her teacup, blessed with reasonably pleasant surroundings and pious counsel? I nodded again, squirming a little. Always and eerily, I had the feeling that Isadora knew more about me than I did. Then, she said, aren't you obliged, given these gifts, to settle down and start a family so you can give to others in even greater measure? Her eyes went quiet, closing as if on a vision of her and me at the altar. My father, you know, was a little like you, Rutherford. Or at least my aunties say he was. He stayed in Scully Square or in the pubs looking for himself in rum and loose women until he met a woman of character, I mean my mother, who brought out his better instincts. What's he doing now? I asked. I rested my teacup on my knee. Your father, what's he doing? Well, she pulled back, pausing to word this just right. He's not doing much just now. He died last winter, you know, from heart failure. Wonderful, I thought. The wage of the family man was coronary thrombosis. And, I said, he was how old? 49? Then Isadora hurried to add, but he had people who cared about him, daughters and sons, and a wife who brought him down to earth. Indeed, I said, quite far down, I'd say. Rutherford, she yipped, her voice sliding up the scale. It hurts me to see you in such ruin. Really, it does. Half the time I see you, you haven't eaten in 2 days, or you're hungover, or someone is chasing you for money, or you've been in a fight. You need a family. You're not common. Ah, there it was, revealed at last. The one thing inside Isadora that made me shudder. It was what you heard all your blessed life from black elders and church women in flowered gowns. Don't be common, comb your hair, be a credit to the race, strive like the Creoles for respectability, for class. It made my insides clench. Oh yes, it mattered to me that Isadora cared, but she saw me as clay, something she could knead beneath her tiny brown fingers into precisely the sort of creature I, after seeing my brother shackled to subservience, was determined not to become, a, quote, gentleman of color. The phrase made me hawk, then spit in a corner of my mind. It conjured for me the image of an Englishman, round of belly, balding, who'd been lightly brushed with brown watercolor or cinnamon. No, Isadora, I shook my head. I don't believe I'll ever get married. There's too much to do, and see, life is too short for me to shackle myself to a mortgage and marriage. I was a breath away from adding, in a house full of gimped cats, but I thought it best to bite my tongue. Her eyes took on a woe-begone, persecuted look, a kind of dying duck expression she had now and then. She stared at me for the longest, and then she flashed, "You just won't act right, will you?" Touching her handkerchief to the doorknob nose, she stood suddenly, her cat leaping from her inskirted knees and bumping blindly into a candle stand. Isadora took 3 paces toward the door. I thought she was about to throw me out. Then she turned to pitch her voice back into the room. Suppose you have to get married, Rutherford Calhoun. Now her eyes burned. What about that? What Isadora meant by this was a mystery to me. She couldn't be pregnant. Not her, and at least not by me. She twisted my fingers whenever I reached for her knee. Have to marry her? It made no sense that afternoon, but less than a fortnight later, her meaning became horribly clear. And I'll stop there. Thank you for being so patient. I've been reading that for 20 years. Does it really? Yes, very well, you gotta, I don't think you ever just give a reading, because that's kind of flat. I think you gotta perform it. And that means you gotta know how it's like an actor. Actors have to know, the character voices. And if you were to ask me, if you were to turn to chapter 10 or 12 and say, oh, would you read that passage? I probably couldn't do it, because I haven't tested it. You have to test it. You have to read it, to see where it speeds up and slows down and how to pronounce words that you wrote, that you better be able to pronounce. So, that section I've read a lot. But please, I've said enough. I would love to hear any. Yes, sir, this gentleman right here.
It's been a while since I read Middle Passage, but I recall somewhere there you mentioned when you gave credit to someone who helped you tremendously with ship terms and terminology about ships.
Yeah.
Had you any knowledge of all that was?
I've never been to sea. I've never been to sea. The only thing I've ever been on a boat is a ferry boat in Puget Sound in Washington State. Well, what it is, my next door neighbor, Eugene Clyde, and now he's 2 neighbors away. He moved away, somebody else moved into his house, somebody else just recently moved into his house. Well, he, in the early 80s, was a shipbuilder, a model shipbuilder. And the federal government would actually hire him to do models very intricately done of their vessels, battleships, things like that. And he had a lot of books, and I started working on this novel, and I said to him, Gene, do you have any books on ships and what they're like constructed in the 19th century? He gave me a wonderful book called The Lore of Ships. It's got everything in it, visuals, illustrations. And then what he did was he offered to build me a slave ship just to see what it would be like, to test himself. I still have it. It's about that long, and he did it for cost, just the cost of material. The main mast is like that high, and it's got 20 feet of rigging that he put on it. And so I was working on the book, and he was doing the ship, and so this is kind of like a memento that I have that Gene Clyde did for me. But his books were very, very useful. I also looked at nautical dictionaries. I read every sea story, to be honest about it. And see, what happened is when I first started writing, I was 22 years old, 1970, and I got an idea for a novel, and I said, well, let me try to write it. And I was a journalist. I was a journalism major. So I was used to writing a lot, 3 stories a week. You got a file. And so I do 10 pages a day, 5 days a week. And you can get a novel basically in 2.5 months that way. I didn't know any better because I was an undergraduate, and we were in a school with a quarter system, right? And I would take a class, I'd start it, and 10 weeks later I'd finish it. So I'd say, why can't I do a novel that way? Start it and finish it, right? So I did 6 novels in 2 years. And the first one was terrible. I did it over the summer, and I didn't know. So I read every book I could on the craft of writing, published by 1970. And I still got some of those books, and some of them are wonderful. They're out of print now, but I'd share them with my students, make photocopies of some of the lessons and so forth. But I taught myself something. The first book was terrible, but I said, I'm really interested now in doing a second story. So let me see if I can improve characterization in the second one. And then, okay, that got a little bit better. Let me see if I can improve description. All right, a little bit. So after 6, I taught myself enough to be able to write what was my first published book, Faith in the Good Thing. And I came into the orbit at that time of a teacher on campus, John Gardner, who was a masterful craftsman. And John looked over my shoulder as I was writing Faith in the Good Thing, and that took 9 months. He slowed me down. I spent 9 months. I thought that was the longest time I ever had to spend on anything in my life, is one project. 9 months? Ever since then, I've spent more time on a book. The one after that, Oxherding Tale, I spent 5 years because I knew what was at stake. I mean, you know what's at stake when you really become serious about being a writer. Middle Passage was 6 years. For Faith in the Good Thing, I threw out 1,200 pages. For Middle Passage, I threw out about 3,000 pages. For Dreamer, I threw out 3,000 pages. When I first started writing the first 6 books, I didn't know how to revise. I didn't know how to do that. You need, I used to talk to my students all the time about this. Think about what you're doing when you write, okay? I'm talking to you, and I can't take my words back. If I say the wrong thing, the wrong word choice, if I say something inadvertently that might offend, I can't take it back. You got to be sympathetic and say, well, he didn't really mean that, or he meant this. In other words, you got to revise my words for me, because I can't take them. But if I'm writing, this is what I came to realize after my first published book, this is the one chance in my life I can get something right. If I'm really willing to revise and go over it and over it, I can get this so that every word, every sentence, every paragraph, the tone, everything is exactly the way I want it. It might take 3,000 pages, but when I'm done, I know I can give this to my son, I know I can give this to my daughter, and I can say, this is my best. Best thought, best technique, best feeling. If I died as soon as I gave it to them, they could say, this is what Daddy really was about at the end of his life. So I became aware of what the stakes were, at least for me with this, that, okay, yeah, I wrote 6 books really fast, and you can do a book that way, and if you're just kind of like doing it for the money, that's one sort of thing. But if you're doing this because it really means something to you, and you're trying to figure something out, and then you're going to give that to somebody else, and you're giving it to them as a gift. That's all. I mean, I think art is a gift. Then it should, I think, be the best that you can make it. And I can think of very few places in your life where you can go over something enough times that you make it as close to you can get it as being perfect, except in writing. And maybe some of the other arts, too. Maybe sculpture, you know what I'm saying? Maybe music, perhaps. Yeah. Several questions. This gentleman right here, and then the one right behind him. The guy, red, yeah. This one? Well, I can tell you exactly why. When I was an undergraduate, 1969, the first black studies courses were taught at Southern Illinois University. I was undergraduate, but I had a friend who was a black graduate student, Tom Slaughter. And we talk a lot because, I take philosophy courses. Tom asked me if I would be one of 10 discussion group leaders for a new course in black studies that was being created by the grad students. There were no professors black professors at the time in '69. So the grad students in different disciplines came together, history, sociology, philosophy, that was Tom Slaughter, and they lectured, just like this. And then there would be 10 of us in the room who would divide up the students, and we would go off and have our weekly discussion. So Tom got me to be one of those discussion group leaders. And I remember exactly, there was a overhead projector screen in the back, and a black history graduate student was lecturing on the Middle Passage. And he put on the overhead projector that cross-section you've all seen of a slave ship, where the bodies are like spoon fashion, little silhouettes. And I looked at that thing, I was sitting there, I said, my God, I've never seen that before. And it just kind of like burned into the emulsion of my mind. And I said, I got to write something about this someday. There was no novel about the Middle Passage at that time. So what happened, the next quarter, they had a visiting black professor from St. Louis came in to do a history course. And we had to do a final paper. And I said, can I do my final paper on the Middle Passage? Because I want to do research. And he said, yeah. So I looked at a lot of ship's logs. And they were all written by white captains. When I wrote my first 6 books, like I said, 1, 2, every quarter, the second one was about the Middle Passage. And the form was a ship's log. But it was told from the viewpoint of the white ship's captain. Because those were the journals I was reading. And what the problem was is he didn't understand, couldn't get close to the slaves that he was bringing into the hold of the ship. They were basically cargo, okay, for him. So I kind of gave up on that after like 150 pages. That's when I came close to finishing, but I didn't really finish it. So after I published a couple of books, Oxherding Tale, After Faith and the Good Thing, I said, let me come back to this. Let me come back to this and figure out if I, because I had the research. You know, I'd done it as an undergraduate. I said, let me see if I can make him a black American. Therefore, he's positioned between the crew and the slaves, the almuseri in this case. He can talk to both of them. He's influenced by both of them. He can look both ways and interact both ways. So in this version, Rutherford Calhoun came into existence. And the captain is somebody that you see, you know, through his eyes. Yeah. Thanks for that question, by the way, because that really does answer some stuff about this. This gentleman right behind, were you? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
How do you typically come about the, I guess you would say, attitude or tone of each individual character?
How do I come about the attitude or the tone?
Yeah.
So, say a little bit more about that. How are they different?
Basically, how do you come up with each character? Like, what difference comes to you to make each character like diverse in each of their attitudes?
How do you do that? How do you do that? I think we draw from life, right? I think the grist of the mill for everything we do in fiction comes from life. Sometimes we'll take 2 or 3 different people that we know and make a composite figure. I mean, you just don't describe one person, you know, because that's not enough to get what you need. But there's somebody kind of like that person, so you take details from that person, right? And so you kind of blend people sometimes. Captain Falcon, we were just talking about this. Captain Falcon is like, little details in his life are taken from the life of Sir Richard Francis Burton, which I read a biography of this guy when I was in high school, and I remember reading it. I couldn't believe there's this guy who was this incredible genius, the translator of the Arabian Nights, a man who could learn, people said of him, any language in 2 weeks' time, and yet he was a staggering racist at the same time. I mean, how does that work together? There's somebody so brilliant, and he invented a pistol of a particular kind. So I found him to be fascinating. So I kind of took a couple of details from Sir Richard Francis Burton, and applied them to Falcon. Burton went looking for the source of the Nile, didn't find it. Falcon went looking for the source of the Nile, didn't find it. Then other characters, like I said, sometimes come from people that you know. Does that make sense? And think about it this way too. Each person in this room has a unique viewpoint on the world. Everybody in this room does. Like I used to tell my kids when they were growing up, my son and my daughter, I would say, I don't care what anybody says to you. Nobody has ever lived or will ever live like you. You are unique, okay? And that's true, I believe, everybody in this room. So when you look at your character and you really ask yourself questions about him or her, how do they see the world? What are their values? What are their backgrounds? You see what I'm saying? Where were they born? What were their parents like? Did they have a particular kind of religious education? What is their self-image? I would give my students, and I'll recommend it to you, a page called The Bone Structure from a book by Lajos Egre, published in the 40s. I think it's called The Art of Dramatic Writing. It was a standard text in Hollywood. Everybody in Hollywood read it for screenwriting. But he's got one page in which it's called The Bone Structure, and it's questions you answer for yourself about every one of your characters. And if you answer all those questions, you don't have to have on the page every answer, but we will be able to intuit or guess something about a character on the basis of what's there. It's called The Art of Dramatic Writing, Lajos Egre. Can I write on something? Yeah. You got a thing? You don't have it? Oh, okay. This is cool. Can I write on this? How do you spell Lajos? No. It's not Lajos. We're going to guess. We're going to Egre? Egre. I think that's right. At any rate, if that ain't right, the title is The Art of Dramatic Writing. And The Art of Dramatic Writing. It's published around 1945. around 1945, and it's still useful. All right, questions, more. We're going to start with this gentleman, then that lady, and then this gentleman. Yes, sir.
You grew up in Southern Illinois?
No, I grew up in Evanston, Illinois. I grew up upstate, yeah.
Can you relate to us your upbringing?
My upbringing? Well, yeah, my mother was in that town much longer than my father, okay? My grandmother had moved there from Georgia and bought a home there. Her husband, my maternal grandfather, died at age 50. My father is from South Carolina, big family. 6 girls, sisters, and 5 brothers. There were like 12 kids, and there would have been a 13th, except one died in birth. When my father was 25, he got an offer from his uncle, my great-uncle Will, his uncle Will, to come north and work if he needed some money. Our great-uncle Will had come to the Chicago area like in the 20s, and he started a construction company. And so he offered the boys work in the 40s, and also the girls if they came up. My father at 25 came up and met my mother, and I am the result of that. And he worked for my uncle for a time. My uncle built churches, black churches, apartment buildings in Evanston. He built, his crew, black crew, built Springfield Baptist Church, if you ever go there. I was born in a place called Community Hospital, because in 1948, there was Evanston Hospital, but it was segregated. And there was a wonderful woman there, Dr. Elizabeth Hill, who was from New Orleans. And she had the awful burden of, if a black person needed hospitalization or to go to an emergency room, she had to take them all the way from Evanston to the south side of Chicago, right? And they died. Some died on the way. So she and a lot of other people petitioned to create a place called Community Hospital, which is right on the canal between Evanston and Skokie. And that's where I was born, actually. It was all black hospital. And my great-uncle Will, I remember, even when Evanston Hospital integrated, he wouldn't go. He went to Community Hospital because he was very loyal to them. As for the high school, my mother went to the high school that I went to, Evanston Township High School, before I did in the 30s. It was integrated way back in time. It was just one of the things about Evanston that was progressive at that time. So that was sort of my, that's where I spent the first 18 years of my life. Okay. Yes, ma'am. In New Orleans? That's a good question. I think maybe because of the slave trade. If you go to New Orleans, are you from New Orleans? So you're kind of familiar with it? The play?
I'm familiar. I guess.
Do you know a place called the Cabildo? The Cabildo?
Yeah.
They used to sell slaves out of there. I think I picked it because the first film I ever did for PBS was actually about a guy from here, from Texas, a black cowboy, Charlie Smith, who got to be 138 years old, and we shot it down around Anahuac, Texas. We chose that location, but he was sold. He was captured in Liberia at the age of 12. He was free in Liberia, okay, but tricked onto a slave ship. People said there were fritters, pancakes, growing on trees in America. So he got on the ship, got brought over here to New Orleans. He was sold the Cabildo to a Texas rancher. His name was really Mitchell Watkins. He was sold to a Texas rancher named Charlie Smith, who took him to here, Texas, and upon his death, the way we wrote it, gave him his name. He wanted Mitchell to take his name. Glenn Turman at the time played him, and a younger kid played him as a kid, but Glenn Turman is a main man, older man, and Richard Ward played him as a grown man. And actually, Charlie Smith was a raconteur. He told stories. He made up stories. He said he rode with Jesse James. You know, I don't believe that. I don't believe he did that. But he made up stories. And so he said he was a bounty hunter, and he captured a guy named Railroad Bill. So we have a Railroad Bill that Morgan Freeman captures. And you know who it is who plays? It's played by Morgan Freeman. It's an early Morgan Freeman role. He had just come off Electric Company. And remember that? And Railroad Bill was a peg. He had a peg leg. So poor Morgan had his leg strapped behind him for the whole production. He was in pain. I wanted to talk to the guy, but I was afraid that, you know, this guy's in too much pain. But he plays, you know, this bad guy, Railroad Bill, captured by Charlie. He's hung at the end of it, and that ends Charlie's his days as a bounty hunter. Anyway, that's why I picked it, because I knew that there was a slave auction house, you know, in New Orleans. I don't really know New Orleans that well. I think it's a great place, though. So, yes, sir. Back to you.
To change gears on a different book, I just finished this recently.
Oh, thank you for reading it.
I'm fascinated with the idea, and I'm wanting to know if it was ever really implemented or thought about using, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the guy's name,
Hyam.
Hyam. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Using this man as a double for Dr. King, that's pure fiction?
That's pure fiction. I'll tell you how I came up with that. It was like I was reading a paper in the 80s, and it was about maybe like Saddam Hussein or somebody, some person who did in fact have a double, or it was proposed that he did. And so a lot of leaders have had doubles, we've been told, actors who would stand in for them. Hitler probably, you know, many. And so I said to myself, well, you know, we don't do that here. Our leaders, our politicians don't seem to have employed doubles. But then the thought, you know, you're a creative writer, it hits you, well, what if, it's the what if. What if we did? And then the next question is, well, who would have one? You know, it's like, well, okay, JFK, he could, that's my first thought. No, I thought, no, King. What if King, there was a man who looked just like this guy, and it was during the campaign that nobody ever talks about, the Chicago campaign. Because people always seem to think King's life was over, you know, with the March on Washington and that famous speech he gave, that little, you know, I Have a Dream segment is all you ever get. Well, he lived on several years after that to 68, and life was not easy on Dr. King. His first northern campaign was where I'm from. That is to say, I'm from Evanston. I mean, there's this one street, Howard Street borders Chicago. We're a northern suburb. So I remember in high school when he was there. And he wasn't there that long. He came in January of my senior year, and he was in and out of town because he'd go back to Atlanta once a week to preach. He was determined to do that. But I remember him being there. And so I said it in Chicago because that campaign is seldom talked about. His life is like in a real pressure cooker in this time, 66. And also because I knew the area pretty well. I didn't know the southern areas, that is, you know, Birmingham. I didn't know them quite as well as I knew Evanston. My wife, like I said, is from South Chicago. So, go ahead.
You also mentioned, I think, didn't you mention that hospital that you just spoke about?
Yeah. Oh, if you read that, no.
Brilliant book, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh, but by the way, if you read that book, the middle section, the Springfield Baptist Church, that's where I have him give a talk. Yes. The old guy, I changed their names, but the contract, that's my great uncle. And the woman doctor, that's the one I just described to you. Right? These are the same people. You know, I was talking about drawing from life, okay? I just changed their names, but gave the real history of those people. They're sitting there when King comes in, it's a fictional scene, to give this big speech. And you don't know if it's the double at the moment or if it's King. But those are all the people I grew up with. And this is the one time in my life, I don't usually write autobiographically, but these people in this town, at this time, I felt was important enough to give these portraits to people and what their lives, the lives of black Americans were like, you know, during King's era, during the Civil Rights era, during all of those years of slavery and segregation that got us to this place. Because a lot of people don't know, you know, they don't remember. And if you're young, you know, in a certain sense, it's not your fault you don't remember what that stuff was like. But I was talking in Mobile, Alabama, last week, actually, Monday. I gave the King speech. And I was talking about the fact that I talked to one young man, and he used to go to the Gap, trying on clothes, buying them. He didn't believe that when I told him when I grew up in Evanston, my father wanted to go back to South Carolina to visit relatives, which we did in the summers. This is a book too. This is the book too. We drive down to South Carolina, and we would want to get something to eat, and there would be a diner, but we couldn't be served. So my dad would have to go around to the back and get served through the back and take the food because we couldn't sit there. That was my first introduction to the South when I was like in 5 or 6. Then we would get to the little town near my grandfather's farm. There's a town nearby. It's like Spartanburg area, Greenwood, Greenville. You go in that town, you tried on clothes, I told this young man. You tried them on in the store, you better buy them. Because if they had been on your skin, white patrons were not going to take it. So you had to buy clothes if you put on. And he's just shocked by this. Well, this is living memory, okay? But if you were 18, 19, there's no reason to remember that. It's like me, somebody who was in World War II, telling me what it was like. And I can read it, but I can't really know what it was like to be 18 years old and going off to Normandy. I just have to take somebody's word on it, So that's why I wanted to capture some of that and those people, from that time period in that book. Thank you for reading it. That was a hard book to do in lots of ways, but I'm glad I did it. Yeah. Okay, a couple more. Oh, my. We may have to say, this gentleman here was first over there, I think, right back there. And then we'll come back. Huh? Rewriting. I would basically try, that's why I got 3,000 pages. I tried one thing one way, and it wouldn't work. And so I had to go back and try it another way. I have a totally different ending for this book in the first draft. It's totally different. If you read this book, you know how it ends. In the earlier version that I did, there is a slave revolt, but then they wander. My working title for Middle Passage was originally Rutherford's Travels, because I was thinking of Gulliver. So, you got the Wenhams and the Brobdingnagians, and you got here the Almuseri. Well, I needed another bunch of people, so I have them stop after the mutiny at an island. And there's a whole bunch of people there called the Aquarians. And Kringle, the first mate, decides that these people are so messed up he can help them, so he stays. Then they go back out to sea again, and then there's a storm. And then I do all this stuff, and finally they get back to New Orleans. But it's not Squibb and Rutherford who survive, and the little girl Belika. It's Tommy, the cabin boy, and Rutherford survive. And they're there for a year. He's looking for Isadora. He came back to look for her, and he can't find her. She didn't wait around for him. He spends all, and so one day after being there for a year or something, they're walking, him and Tommy, down the street, and they pass a black church, and the door's open. And it's like a weekday or something, but a baby's being baptized. And he kind of looks around and says, well, who's in there? And it's his brother. Jackson has come looking for him and met Isadora. And they are so alike. They are so alike, they get married. And they have a baby. That's why I had to make it a year. And they're baptizing the baby, Rutherford, after his brother lost at sea, they think. So he looks at that and he says, I could interrupt this. I could say I'm alive and I'm here, but that's my brother who I love, and that's Isadora who I love, and they're getting along pretty well. So he says to Tommy, let's just go. And then they go looking for a ship, because he's a sailor now. And they go back out to sea. That was one ending. And I ditched that because I said, wait a minute. Two things. Once they're on that ship, they leave Africa, they should never set foot on land, because you break the tension. Part of the tension is you can drown. You can die. So don't ever get them on an island. So I didn't do that. Second thing is I felt that these two needed to get united again, Rutherford and Isadora. I mean, it's been a long time, and he's gone through a lot, and he is Odysseus, and she is Penelope, by the end of this. So they got to get together. So I have this other ship, this pleasure ship, and you know the story at the end of that. So basically, the answer to your question is you try out something and it doesn't work. And then you put it in a box. There is a book that you might find interesting. What did I do with that thing? It came out some time ago. I don't remember. Oh, I know what it is. Oh, does this work? No, it doesn't work. Let me try this one. If you ever want to take a look at, oh, this doesn't work either. We're going to go through a lot. We just had one. We just had one. Okay. There's a book that came out, anthology called Literary Outtakes, and it's edited by Larry Dark. And it's nothing but stuff poets, short story writers, and novelists of titles you know took out of their books. And I have a little section, actually from my other novel, Oxherding Tale, in there as a scene. But basically, you had to write it, you put it in your drawer. It may be wonderful, but you couldn't use it. Oh, if you want a better example than this, Ralph Ellison's second novel that he spent 37 years on and didn't finish is now out and available. 2,000 pages. That, yeah. You want to read a lot of outtakes? They're in there. All right, this lady, and then we'll do this gentleman, and then this. We got a little time, okay? And then this lady. Go ahead. See, I can do this all day. Yes, ma'am. Wasn't somebody right here? Oh, yeah, there you are. Okay.
One thing that you haven't touched on is your experience with cartoons, and because I'm particularly interested in cartoons and particularly political cartoons, could you tell me, did you start with cartoons first and then later writing, or was it at the same time?
No, I was a cartoonist. I started in high school. When I was a kid in Evanston Township High School, in the elementary school, I mean, the one class I got my best grades in was drawing. I mean, it was the art classes. I got patted on the head because I could do that. I wasn't so good in some of my other classes, okay, at the time, and that's all I wanted to do was draw. All I wanted to do was draw. So I'll tell you a story. When I was about 13 or 14, I announced to my father that I was going to be an artist. I was going to be an illustrator. And my dad freaked. My dad was a practical man. He was also a man who had grown up in the South. And he said that he was concerned about my future. He said, Chuck, they don't let black people do that. Now, as it turns out, I had been a reader of Writer's Digest. And one of the reasons is they would do profiles of cartoonists, right? And stories about cartoonists, my heroes. And there was an ad in one of them for a course with a guy named Lawrence Lariar in New York, Jewish guy. He was cartoon editor of Parade magazine. He published over 100 books. He wrote under pseudonyms, detective stories. Lariar published over 100 books. Lariar was not his original name. So I wrote to him. I was like 13 years old. I said, Mr. Lariar, I read your ad. And my dad tells me, they don't let black people do this. I got back a letter in a week from Lawrence Lariar. He said, your father is wrong. You can do whatever you want. If you have, all you need is a good teacher. And so I took a letter to my dad. Said, see this? And my father said, okay, what do I know? And he paid for my course with Lawrence Lariar for 2 years through the mail. And so I got to know Lariar, and I would take the bus from Evanston to actually Brooklyn, we had relatives, stay with them and go out to Long Island where he lived, sometimes during the summer. And he'd show me art and give me, published card, because he did a lot of work. He was an early Disney man. He didn't draw, but he was an idea man for Disney. And he worked on strips and so forth. You look him up, you'll see he's got a lot of books. So by the time I was 17, I finished his course. That's when I started publishing. There was a magic company in Chicago, a buddy of mine told me about it because he was doing some drawing for him. They needed somebody to do illustrations. So I took my swatch, my drawing sketches, and they let me do it, and they paid me, so I crossed over and became a professional. And then for my high school paper, a lot of stuff. The comic strips, panels. I collaborated with a guy that I ate lunch with every day. And he just contacted me recently because he found some of my old drawings from high school. And this is like within the last 2 months, okay? And so we were still in conversation. I mean, we're talking 1965, all right? And he's out on the West Coast now and doing something else. So when I went to college, I had some stuff published, and so I went right to the student newspaper. And I said, okay, I published this. Can I work for you guys? They paid. The Southern Illinoisan had a staff, associated with the journalism school. So I drew all the way through college. And for the WSIU TV, I did a TV show teaching people how to draw called Charlie's Pad in 1970. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting started around 1968, 69, somewhere. Well, I wrote to them one day. I said, well, look, you guys, in the student paper, in the town paper, you see my editorial cartoons. Would you be interested at WSIU TV? Am I doing a TV show? And I didn't expect an answer. But they wrote me back and they bid. Well, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting had just been started, right, founded, and they needed programming. So all they had to have was a drawing table, 2 cameras, and me at the drawing table. It was cheap. It was cheap. We did 15-minute shows, and I actually used Lariar's lessons as the basis, for the shows, shows. And then I do a wrap-up show. I still get letters from people. I got a letter from a guy about last year who saw it when he was a kid, and I taught him how to draw rabbits. And he drew rabbits for his daughter, he told me, right? I still got that letter somewhere. So that was my life. That's all, and I was a journalist, too. That was what I did, and that was great preparation for writing, actually. Journalism is really good preparation. You learn 3 major, before there were writing programs, where did writers learn their craft? Writing programs like Iowa started after World War II. So writers like Hemingway, London, all these people worked on newspapers. And you learn 3 things I think that are crucial. You learn to write a lot. You got to do 3 stories a week. You learn to write for a mass audience.
You get some positive nod from the journalists.
Where are the journalists? Right there. No, they know. You learn to write for a mass audience. You learn to do research. You learn how to go out and interview people, talk to them, get their quotes right. You go to the morgue to get the history and the background. And then the really important thing you learn after that is not to see your copy as sacred. Because you write it, it goes across the room to the editor. He can take out a paragraph you love, he can add something, and then your name still is on it. So you realize it's not written in concrete or gold, but rather it is subject to revision. Those are the main things, for the most part, you learn in a writing program. I mean, that's an education that's so valuable, journalism. So it's been a good, so for me it was a good thing. I'm sorry, I took up a lot of time with that. How are we doing?
We're over that, I think.
Well, there's some people, now I want the same people who had their hand up before. Like that gentleman, I think you did. Yes, sir.
Have you ever used any of your family members to come up with characters for your novels?
Any of my family members? I have a cousin. He came to Evanston to visit from South Carolina when I was 11. And he was 9. His name is Alpha Omega Holmes. I only met him that one. I thought that's a great name. So in my first published novel, Faith in the Good Thing, I used his name. And the novel comes out, and one day my dad calls me. I'm in graduate school. I'm in graduate school at Stony Brook, and my dad calls me. And he says, well, your cousin sent your novel down to Alpha's mother, and they're talking about suing you. Here I am in graduate school, broke, and my relatives, they called my publisher. And nothing came of it. But I learned my lesson. In future editions of that book, that character has a different last name. I changed that, and I will never do that again. I will never use with that unless it's with the person's permission. In some of my novels, I'll have like a colleague of mine, like at UW, but they're cool about it. You know what I'm saying? They don't mind. So I think you got to be very careful about doing something like that. Let's see, this gentleman and then this lady. Yes, sir.
How do you write with such elaborate expressions? Like, what have you choose, like, with your feelings?
I'm sorry. Expressions?
Yeah.
Like, give me an example.
Like how you choose what you really like. Yeah, like we use like a shot of what was it?
Opium. I think he taught, well, see the thing, I think the language is based on the guy who's talking. It's first person. And so his way of talking is totally different from the first person in Dreamer. Totally different.